What if the exact same people who, spent years fighting the Nazis in Europe, the underground resistance, the partisans, the people we celebrate in all those movies,
Yeah.
what if they were actively hunted down, suppressed, and just completely crushed by the United States government the Second World War II ended?
I mean, it sounds completely inverted, right? It sounds like an alternate reality.
It really does. It sounds like the plot of a dystopian novel. But that is exactly the historical premise we are jumping into today for this deep dive.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to this and feeling an immediate, spike of defensiveness, that is completely natural.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are all taught from kindergarten that the U.S. emerged from World War II as the undisputed champion of global democracy. So hearing a theory that U.S. planners actually viewed democracy as a threat or a rot is incredibly jarring.
It requires a complete paradigm shift. And that is really our mission for this deep dive. We are unpacking a profound, highly controversial alternative history of U.S. foreign policy.
Right, based on some very specific source material.
Exactly. Based specifically on a text called How the World Works. It's a compilation of interviews, speeches, and analysis by the prominent social critic Noam Chomsky. And it was edited by Arthur Neyman.
Yeah.
We're basically looking at decades of declassified, top-secret memos, geopolitical strategy, and all these hidden historical mechanisms.
Now let's establish a crucial ground rule right at the top here. The material we are exploring contains heavily critical, politically charged viewpoints regarding the United States.
Very much so.
So we want to be abundantly clear to you, the listener. We are not taking sides.
Right. We are not endorsing these claims.
Not at all. Our job today is strictly analytical. We are going to unpack the factual content, debate the historical mechanisms, and just lay out the internal logic of Chomsky's arguments so you can evaluate them for yourself.
Exactly. We are looking at the blueprint of global power as Chomsky presents it.
Right.
And, to understand that blueprint, we really have to start at the absolute baseline, which is the immediate aftermath of World War II.
Right. So we are in 1945. The war is over.
The war is over. And the geopolitical landscape is just completely unrecognizable.
Yeah.
Every other major industrial power, Germany, Great Britain, Japan, France, they are in absolute ruins. Their infrastructure is bombed out. Their economies are shattered.
But the United States.
The United States' national territory is completely untouched by the conflict. In fact, American industrial production actually tripled during the war.
Which is wild to think about. And that leads to this staggering statistic that basically anchors this entire analysis. In 1945, the United States possessed literally 50% of the entire world's wealth.
It's hard to even fathom.
Half of the globe's wealth concentrated in a single nation.
Along with total military control of both sides of both major oceans. Never in human history had one nation held that kind of disproportionate power.
Right.
So the central question of how the world works, the engine driving everything we're about to discuss, is basically this. Given that unprecedented, almost unimaginable wealth and security, how did U.S. policy planners intend to keep it that way?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the traditional high school history version says we use that power to rebuild the world and spread freedom.
Right.
But Chomsky is arguing that the primary goal wasn't spreading democracy at all, but explicitly hoarding that 50% wealth disparity.
Yes. And he bases this not on, outside speculation, but on the actual declassified internal planning documents from the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations.
The actual memos.
Exactly. In these top-secret rooms, the planners all agreed that U.S. dominance had to be maintained. There was no debate about whether to maintain it.
Just how to do it.
Right. The only debate was how. And Chomsky outlines two distinct camps in this planning phase. You have the hardliners and the doves.
Let's start with the hardliners.
So the hardline extreme is best represented by a highly classified document called National Security Council Memorandum 68, or NSC 68.
Okay.
This was drafted in 1950 by Paul Nitze, a man who, interestingly enough, later served as Ronald Reagan's arms control negotiator.
And what was Nitze's pitch in this document?
Well, NSC 68 called for a highly militaristic rollback strategy. The explicit goal was to foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system itself.
Wow.
But to do that, Nitze argued, the United States had to radically change its own domestic society.
Change it how? Like preparing for World War III?
Essentially, yes. It required what the document actually called sacrifice and discipline from the American public. Mechanically, that meant massive, unprecedented peacetime military expenditures.
Right.
It meant deliberately cutting back on social services, education, and domestic welfare just to fund this massive military-industrial complex.
So tightening the belt at home to build weapons.
Exactly. And crucially, NSC 68 warned against the excess of tolerance in American society.
Excess of tolerance, what does that even mean in this context?
It basically meant advocating for the suppression of domestic dissent to keep the public completely aligned with this aggressive global posture.
Okay, so the hardline approach is essentially turn the U.S. into an armed camp, starve domestic social programs, and aggressively push back the Soviets.
Yeah, pretty much.
That sounds intense, but it kind of tracks with the Cold War paranoia we always hear about. But here is where the book really throws a wrench in things. Let's look at the other side of this debate, the so-called doves.
Right. The liberal extreme of the planning spectrum.
And the leading figure here is George Kennan. He headed the State Department planning staff.
He did.
And historically, he's known as the architect of containment, right? He's usually portrayed as the rational, measured diplomat trying to avoid a nuclear war.
That is the standard narrative, yes.
But the book points to a specific top-secret document he wrote in 1948 called Policy Planning Study 23, or PPS 23.
And when you read the actual text of PPS 23,
Yeah.
I mean, it is breathtakingly cynical.
I have the quote right here. Kennan writes, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity."
Very blunt.
He then goes on to say that to do this, the U.S. must dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming.
Yeah, and he doesn't stop there. He explicitly states we should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization.
Unreal objectives.
Right. He finishes by saying, the day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts.
Straight power concepts. I'm having a really hard time wrapping my head around this.
No, it's a lot.
If you are the rational, liberal dove of the State Department, and you are literally writing down, stop talking about human rights and democratization, we just need to maintain our wealth disparity, how is this the dove position?
Because Kennan wasn't advocating for turning the U.S. into a militarized Sparta like Nietzsche was.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Kennan believed you could maintain the global monopoly through economics, political subversion, and strategic leverage rather than overt apocalyptic warfare.
It's like a corporate monopoly.
Exactly.
In private, behind closed boardroom doors, the executives aren't talking about making the world a better place. They're looking at a spreadsheet and saying, we own 50% of the market share. Crush the competition, buy out the suppliers, and play ruthless hardball to make sure no one else can ever threaten our margin.
That is exactly the dynamic the source is describing. But Kennan also understood that you cannot sell straight power concept to the American public.
Obviously not.
You cannot tell taxpayers, hey, we're going to overthrow a government to protect corporate profit margins. So in these internal memos, the planners explicitly agreed on the necessity of a dual reality.
The PR playbook.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Internally, policy is dictated by power and wealth concentration. Externally, to pacify the domestic population, the U.S. would trumpet what Kennan referred to as idealistic slogans.
So the public hears spreading democracy and human rights while the planners actually execute straight power concepts.
Yes.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating mechanical shifts in the book, the redefining of the word communism.
This is huge.
Right, because if the goal is protecting U.S. economic dominance, how did these planners actually define the enemy?
This is crucial to understand. If you follow Chomsky's logic, communism in these internal State Department documents rarely meant an actual direct alliance with Moscow.
Okay.
Instead, the U.S. redefined the term practically. A communist was effectively anyone who believed that a local government had a direct responsibility for the welfare of its own people.
Wait, let's pause on that. If a local movement in a developing country just wanted to, build hospitals, keep their own natural resources, and prioritize local welfare over foreign investment, they were categorized as communists.
Yes, because they were committing the ultimate heresy against this whole grand area strategy. The book cites a 1955 high-level study group, which stated that the essential threat of the communist powers was their refusal to fulfill their service role.
Meaning their role was basically to complement the industrial economies of the West. They exist just to provide cheap labor and raw materials.
Precisely. If a peasant cooperative in Latin America decides to grow black beans to feed their own village, instead of growing coffee to export to U.S. markets, they are failing their service role.
Wow.
By prioritizing domestic welfare, they are economically harming U.S. investors. Therefore, under this internal logic, they are a hostile threat that must be neutralized, and the public justification will be that they are communists.
Okay, so that is the blueprint. But how does this actually play out on the ground in 1945? Because the book argues that to rebuild this global economy to suit U.S. interests, to ensure everyone played their service role, the U.S. had to forge some truly unthinkable alliances in Europe immediately after the war.
To understand this, we really have to look at the state of Europe right at that moment. The traditional right-wing order, the big businesses, the industrialists, many of them had actively collaborated with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy.
Right.
And they did that because fascism protected private property and crushed labor unions.
Which, I mean, Ford and IBM doing business with the Third Reich is a fairly well-documented piece of history at this point.
Exactly. But during the war, the primary force fighting the Nazis on the ground in places like France, Italy, and Greece was the anti-fascist resistance.
Partisans.
Right. And this resistance was heavily comprised of socialists, communists, and radical Democrats. When the war ended, these resistance fighters had massive popular support.
Naturally.
They wanted a new egalitarian society. They wanted labor rights.
But according to the Kennan Blueprint, labor rights and egalitarianism are a direct threat to the 50% wealth monopoly.
Yes, exactly. U.S. planners realized that to rebuild Europe as a massive, profitable market for U.S. exports, they had to restore the pre-war conservative business climate. They needed compliant, cheap labor.
And the single biggest obstacle to cheap, compliant labor was the anti-fascist resistance.
Exactly.
So we essentially turn on our own allies. The book details some horrific specifics here. Let's talk about France first.
In France, President Roosevelt actually installed Admiral Jean Darlan as the Governor-General of French North Africa.
And who was Darlan?
Darlan wasn't just some mild conservative. He was a leading Nazi collaborator. He was the literal author of the anti-Semitic laws for the Vichy government.
That is just, wow. And what about Italy? Italy's where the CIA cut its teeth, right?
Yes, Italy is a massive case study here.
Yeah.
In Italy, the anti-fascist resistance was incredibly popular.
Yeah.
There was a very real chance that a worker and peasant-based leftist coalition was going to win the 1948 democratic elections entirely legally.
Just through the ballot box.
Right. So, following Winston Churchill's advice, the U.S. initially imposed a right-wing dictatorship under Field Marshal Badoglio and King Victor Emmanuel III.
Both of whom had collaborated with Mussolini's fascist regime.
Exactly. But the 1948 elections were still looming.
Right. So how exactly did the U.S. stop a democratic election without looking like the bad guys?
Through National Security Council Memorandum 1, or NSC-1, this was basically the CIA's first major covert operation.
How did it work?
Mechanically, they didn't just drop bombs. They used financial and social subversion. They funneled massive amounts of secret money to centrist and right-wing political parties. And they orchestrated this massive letter-writing campaign from Italian Americans to threaten their relatives back home in Italy.
Threaten them how? Like, what did the letter say?
They explicitly stated that if the left won, the U.S. would cut off all Marshall Plan food and aid, essentially starving the country.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and they also worked with the Vatican to tell Italians that voting for the left was a mortal sin. They restored elements of the old fascist police force specifically to break up labor strikes. They systematically dismantled the democratic process to ensure the right people won.
And in Greece, it wasn't just subversion, right? It was an actual bloodbath.
It really was.
The book describes a U.S.-supported war that resulted in 160,000 deaths. We funded torture and re-education camps just to destroy the local unions and restore a regime that included literal Nazi collaborators. Which brings us to arguably the most disturbing detail in this entire section. Klaus Barbie.
Yes. The Butcher of Lyon.
For those who don't know, Klaus Barbie was a notoriously sadistic SS officer and Gestapo chief in Lyon, France. He personally tortured prisoners, deported thousands of Jews to extermination camps, and murdered resistance leaders.
He was a monster.
How mechanically, legally, morally, how does the book explain the U.S. government hiring this man after the war?
The book relies on the sheer, brutal logic of the planners. An officer from the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps was actually quoted explaining that Barbie's skills were badly needed.
Needed for what?
Well, because Barbie's entire career in the Gestapo was spent infiltrating, hunting, and destroying the underground French resistance.
And since the U.S. was now targeting that exact same resistance to restore the corporate business climate, Barbie's resume was suddenly highly relevant.
Precisely. The logic is horrifyingly cold. If your goal is to crush radical democratic ideals and labor movements, who better to employ than the Gestapo specialists who had just spent 5 years perfecting how to do exactly that?
That is just chilling. But it gets worse, right? Because when the heat got too high in Europe, when Nazi hunters started closing in on figures like Barbie, the U.S. didn't just fire them.
No, they didn't. According to the text, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, with the alleged assistance of elements within the Vatican, utilized what were known as rat lines.
Rat lines.
Yes, they smuggled these Gestapo specialists out of Europe and spirited them away to Latin America.
And they didn't just go into quiet retirement down there.
Far from it. In places like Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil, these former SS officers became highly valued security consultants.
Unbelievable.
They literally taught the torture techniques devised in the Nazi death camps to the police and military forces of U.S.-backed Latin American dictatorships. Chomsky argues this is the direct mechanical link between the fascism of World War II and the death squads of Latin America in the Cold War era.
Okay, we need to take a breath here. Because the transition from liberators of Europe to smuggling the Gestapo to South America is massive.
It is.
But it sets the stage perfectly for how the U.S. operated in the Third World. If Europe was managed to become an industrial market, what was the specific role of the Third World in this grand area strategy?
Well, Kennan laid it out very clearly. The Third World was to be exploited. Its assigned function was just to provide cheap raw materials and act as a dumping ground for the manufactured goods of the industrial capitalist societies.
And the primary threat to that exploitation wasn't Soviet invasion.
No, not at all. Serious U.S. analysts, including President Eisenhower, did not actually anticipate Soviet military aggression as the primary threat in the developing world. The real threat was what planners called ultranationalism.
Which goes back to our new definition of communism. Ultranationalism is just a country wanting to use its own resources to improve the lives of its own citizens.
Exactly. It's the demand for independent development. And this brings us to one of the most critical conceptual frameworks in the book, the public domino theory versus the internal threat of a good example.
The domino theory is what everyone knows. It's what justified Vietnam. The idea that if one country falls to communism, the neighboring country falls, and soon enough, the enemy is landing on the beaches of California.
Right. But the book argues that rational planners never actually believed the domino theory in a military sense. They didn't think Ho Chi Minh was going to sail across the Pacific and invade Seattle.
Right.
What they actually feared was the threat of a good example, which internal documents sometimes refer to as the rotten apple theory.
Dean Acheson, Truman's Secretary of State, warned that one rotten apple can spoil the barrel. But what is the rot?
The rot is successful social and economic development outside the control of U.S. investors.
Let's use an analogy here because this is vital. Imagine the global economy is dominated by a massive, ruthless tech monopoly.
Okay.
They charge exorbitant fees, they lock everyone into their proprietary ecosystem, and everyone just accepts it because it's the only game in town. Then, a tiny, bootstrapped startup in a garage builds an open source alternative. It's free, it works better, and it treats its users well.
And how does the monopoly react?
The monopoly doesn't look at that tiny startup and think, oh no, they have 5 employees, they're going to violently conquer our corporate headquarters.
Right, they don't fear a military takeover.
Exactly. They fear the idea. They fear that if this tiny startup succeeds, every other customer is going to look at it and say, wait, why are we paying this massive monopoly? Why not us? We can do this too.
Absolutely.
So the monopoly uses all its billions of dollars to utterly crush the startup, not because the startup is strong, but because its mere existence proves that an alternative is possible.
That is the threat of a good example, perfectly encapsulated. And it explains U.S. military interventions that otherwise make absolutely no strategic sense. Look at Laos in the 1960s.
The book notes Laos was arguably the poorest country in the world at the time, mostly subsistence farmers.
Yet, when a low-level social revolution began, when farmers started organizing for better land distribution and just basic health clinics, Washington subjected Laos to a murderous secret bombing campaign.
Secret bombings.
Yeah, they dropped more bombs on Laos than were dropped during all of World War II. Why? Because if the poorest peasants on Earth can successfully organize and improve their lives without Western capital, it sends a dangerous message to the rest of Southeast Asia.
It's the same logic for Grenada in 1983.
Yes.
We're talking about an island of 100,000 people whose main export is nutmeg.
Nutmeg.
Right. But they began a mild social revolution focusing on literacy and cooperative farming, and the United States literally launched a military invasion.
Because Grenada was a rotten apple.
Hmm.
If they succeeded, maybe Jamaica would try it, maybe Trinidad. The smaller and weaker the country, the more dangerous their success is, as an ideological example.
And this is how Chomsky explains the entirety of the Vietnam War. It wasn't a blunder or a quagmire where the U.S. misunderstood the situation.
No, Chomsky argues Vietnam was actually a massive, calculated success for U.S. planners.
Wait, a success. The U.S. lost the war, pulled out in 1975, and the country fell to the north. How is that a success?
Because you have to look at what the actual goal was. The goal wasn't necessarily to hold the territory. The goal was to destroy the virus of independent development.
The virus.
Right? The U.S. planners feared that a successful independent Vietnam would inspire Thailand, Malaya, and Indonesia to also pursue independent paths. So the U.S. military completely obliterated the physical and economic infrastructure of Indochina. They poisoned the agriculture, bombed the cities, and left the country in absolute ruin.
So even though the U.S. troops left, Vietnam was in no position to be a good example for anyone.
Exactly. You can't look at a country devastated by Agent Orange and napalm and say, hey, let's copy their economic model. The virus was killed, the rot was contained.
Wow.
The surrounding barrel Indonesia, Thailand, remained firmly within the U.S. economic sphere. Under straight power concepts, it was a mission accomplished.
And the book argues this paranoia about the good example wasn't limited to the Third World. It reached all the way to Chile.
Right. In 1970, Salvador Allende was democratically elected in Chile. He was a democratic socialist who wanted to nationalize the copper mines, which were largely owned by U.S. corporations.
And Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, explicitly viewed Allende as a virus.
Yes, Kissinger's internal memos show he wasn't afraid of a Chilean military attack. He was terrified that Allende's democratic success would infect the region.
It's always about the spread.
More incredibly, Kissinger worried it would spread all the way to Europe. He feared the Chilean model would inspire Italian voters to revive the exact same workers' movements the CIA had fought so hard to suppress back in 1948.
So the CIA backed a military coup in 1973, Allende ended up dead, and General Pinochet was installed,
Yes.
ushering in decades of torture and dictatorship, all to protect the copper mines and kill the virus.
Which perfectly illustrates how interconnected this system is. Managing the Third World was vital, but it was fundamentally about controlling the global economy. Which brings us to the next massive pillar of the book, how the U.S. managed its actual industrial rivals.
Right, because the U.S. wasn't alone in the world forever. By the 1970s, the text notes the global economy was drifting into a trilateral world. 3 major economic blocks.
You have a yen-based bloc centered on Japan, covering East Asia, a euro-based bloc led by Germany and Europe, and a dollar-based bloc including the U.S., Canada, and Latin America.
But wait, we just talked about how Japan and Germany were our moral enemies in WWII. Why did the U.S. allow them to become economic powerhouses again?
Because U.S. planners needed them. They needed Japan to be the great workshop of the East and Germany to be the workshop of Europe. U.S. corporations needed these advanced industrial nations to buy American goods and process raw materials.
Okay, that makes sense economically.
However, they wanted them to act as junior partners, entirely subordinate to the overarching power of the United States.
Okay, but mechanically, how do you do that? How do you let Japan rebuild its massive industrial base, but guarantee they never challenge U.S. dominance again?
You control their lifeline.
Why
And
not?
the book points back to George Kennan for the solution.
Kennan again.
Kennan proposed that the U.S. encourage Japanese industrialization, but with one critical limitation. The United States must strictly control Japan's energy imports, specifically their oil.
Kennan called this a veto power.
Yes, Japan has virtually no domestic energy resources. An industrial workshop cannot run without fuel. If the U.S. controls the spigot that fuels the Japanese economy, the U.S. holds a perpetual veto over Japanese policy.
Wow.
If Japan ever tried to step out of line or create a trading bloc that excluded the U.S., Washington could simply threaten to cut off their oil.
This is a huge paradigm shift. Let's pause on this. Because if we follow this logic, it completely rewrites our entire understanding of U.S. strategy in the Middle East. The standard narrative is that the U.S. cares about the Middle East because Americans love big cars, and we need cheap gas. We need Saudi oil for domestic consumption. But the book points out a crucial historical fact. During this early Cold War period, the U.S. didn't actually need Middle Eastern oil at all.
Exactly. North America, the U.S., and Canada led the entire world in oil production until 1968. The U.S. was completely energy independent.
So if we didn't need the oil for ourselves, why did we spend trillions of dollars, stage coups like in Iran in 1953, and build massive military bases in the Persian Gulf?
Because we didn't need the oil for ourselves.
Right.
We needed to control it so that others couldn't have it independently.
Huh.
According to Chomsky, the primary strategic goal in the Middle East was to keep our hands on the lever of world power. By controlling Middle Eastern oil production, two things happened. First, the immense profits of the oil trade flowed primarily into U.S. and British banks.
And second,
Second, and more importantly, it maintained that exact veto power Kennan designed. It kept the leash firmly tightened around the necks of our industrial rivals, Japan and Western Europe.
it's unbelievable leverage. We essentially held the oxygen supply for the entire trilateral world.
Yeah.
So the U.S. is holding this energy leash on Asia and Europe. But meanwhile, in its own backyard, the dollar-based bloc of Latin America, the U.S. is utilizing much more direct, brutal methods of control. The text sarcastically calls this the good neighbor policy.
The book asks a very pointed, data-driven question here. How well did the U.S. follow Kennan's 1948 advice to put aside human rights and focus on straight power concepts?
Right.
To answer this, Chomsky looks at the actual flow of U.S. foreign aid.
He cites a study by Lars Schultz, an academic specialist on human rights.
Right. Schultz analyzed U.S. aid to Latin America and found a direct, undeniable correlation. U.S. aid flowed disproportionately to the Latin American governments that actively tortured their own citizens.
That is a horrifying correlation. The worse a government treated its people, the more money Washington sent them.
Yeah.
But why? Is the U.S. just cartoonishly evil, sitting in a volcano lair funding torture for fun?
No, and this is where Chomsky introduces a broader, global study by economist Edward S. Herman. Herman found the exact same correlation. Worldwide torture correlates with U.S. aid.
But what is the reason?
Herman explains the mechanism behind the correlation. It's not that U.S. planners love torture. It's that both U.S. aid and government torture correlate independently with a third factor, improving the climate for business operations.
Okay, break that down for me. How does torture improve a business climate?
To create an optimal climate for foreign investment, corporations need extremely cheap labor, zero environmental regulations, and zero labor unions. To achieve this, the U.S. imposes what the book calls the agro-export model on developing nations.
Let's get into the mechanics of this model. What does it actually look like on the ground?
Under the agro-export model, a country is forced to stop growing local subsistence crops, things like corn and beans that feed the local population. Instead, the land is consolidated into massive plantations owned by a tiny elite or foreign corporations. They pivot entirely to growing cash crops for export to the first world: coffee, sugar, bananas, beef.
The book uses President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress as a prime example of this. Under that program, beef production in Latin America skyrocketed. But local beef consumption in those same countries actually declined.
Because the beef wasn't for the locals, it's for American fast food chains. So mechanically what happens? You force millions of peasants off their land to make way for massive export plantations.
Right.
Those displaced peasants flood into the cities, creating a desperate, starving, massive pool of cheap labor for sweatshops.
But eventually, when a population is forced into starvation to serve an export economy, they push back.
Inevitably. They try to form unions, they try to organize peasant cooperatives, they demand basic wages.
And a union demanding higher wages ruins the favorable business climate.
Exactly. So to maintain that climate, the ruling elites, armed, trained, and funded by U.S. aid, must use terror, disappearances, and torture to crush the opposition. The torture isn't arbitrary. It is the necessary enforcement mechanism of the economic model.
The book highlights Brazil as the ultimate case study of this dynamic. In 1964, the U.S. backed a military coup that overthrew a moderately populist government. Following the coup, Brazil experienced what Western economists heavily praised as an economic miracle.
The gross national product went through the roof. Foreign investment poured in. On paper, looking purely at the macroeconomic data, Brazil was a massive success story for capitalism.
But Chomsky forces us to look at the human reality underneath the spreadsheet.
The military leaders who orchestrated this miracle instituted what the text calls a neo-Nazi-style national security state. The wealth generated by the soaring GNP was funneled almost entirely to foreign investors and a tiny domestic elite.
And everyone else.
The masses were completely impoverished.
The statistics the book provides are devastating. Brazil is one of the most naturally resource-rich countries on the planet. Yet under this miracle, millions of Brazilians were living in squalid slums, or literally sleeping under highway bridges.
It was incredibly bleak.
The Ministry of Education released a report stating that over a third of their entire education budget was spent on providing school meals. Well, providing them because the students were quite literally starving to death.
The infant mortality rate under the Brazilian miracle was actually higher than in Sri Lanka, which is vastly poorer in natural resources.
It sounds exactly like a ruthless corporate turnaround. Imagine a private equity firm buys a factory. The stock price goes through the roof, the executives get massive bonuses, the shareholders are thrilled.
Right.
But the actual factory floor workers are locked inside, their safety equipment is taken away, their pay is slashed, and they are starving. The balance sheet looks like a miracle, but the human reality is a complete nightmare.
And Chomsky points out how this system evolves over time. Overt military dictatorships and death squads are messy. Eventually, they become a PR liability. So the control shifts to international financial institutions.
Like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
Yes. The book explains how the debt trap works mechanically. During the years of military dictatorship, these corrupt regimes take on massive loans from international banks, often to buy military equipment or build vanity infrastructure projects.
Okay.
When those regimes eventually fall or transition to civilian rule, the massive debt remains.
The citizens are saddled with the bill for the weapons used to oppress them.
Exactly. And when the country inevitably struggles to pay back these massive loans, the IMF steps in as the lender of last resort. But IMF loans come with strict conditions, known as structural adjustment programs, or liberalization.
Wait, how does a bank actually force a sovereign nation to change its laws?
By tying the release of the loan money directly to policy changes. The IMF will say, we will save your economy from default, but you must implement austerity.
And mechanically, that means what?
It means the government is forced to slash spending on public health, cut the education budget, eliminate subsidies for basic food staples, and privatize public utilities, selling off the water and electricity grids to foreign corporations.
So it achieves the exact same goals as the military coup, enriching foreign investors and impoverishing the local population, but it does it with a spreadsheet instead of a death squad.
It creates a permanent, two-tiered society, a super-rich elite integrated into the global economy, and a massive marginalized underclass. It is a self-perpetuating system of control.
But sometimes spreadsheets aren't enough. To truly understand how far U.S. planners would go to protect this business climate, Chomsky moves from the macroeconomics to harrowing, highly specific case studies from Central America in the 1980s.
Yes.
And I want to issue a warning to you, the listener. The details we're about to discuss from the text are intensely graphic and disturbing. We debated how much to include, but the source insists on these details to make its central point. The violence wasn't an accident.
The first major case study is El Salvador. In the 1970s, El Salvador saw a massive growth of what were called popular organizations.
Which means what, exactly?
We're not talking about armed guerrillas initially. We're talking about peasant associations, labor unions, and heavily Catholic Bible study groups pushing for social justice based on liberation theology.
They were trying to organize politically to demand basic human rights, fair wages, and land reform. In other words, they were raising the threat of actual functioning democracy.
In February 1980, the Archbishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero, saw the escalating violence by the right-wing military junta. He wrote a direct, desperate plea to U.S. President Jimmy Carter.
Begging him to stop.
Romero begged Carter not to send military aid, explicitly warning that the U.S. weapons and money would be used to sharpen the repression against the people's organizations.
Carter ignored him. The aid was sent. And just weeks later, Archbishop Romero was assassinated. He was shot through the heart while celebrating Mass.
The text notes that a man named Roberto de Bisson, a neo-fascist with deep ties to the death squads, is generally assumed to be responsible. De Bisson's political party, Arena, would actually go on to govern El Salvador with U.S. support.
Which is wild.
Chomsky highlights the media hypocrisy here. A decade later, when thousands gathered in San Salvador for a commemorative mass for Romero, the United States representation was entirely absent, and the mainstream U.S. media largely ignored the anniversary.
But the violence only escalated after Romero's death. The book argues that the state of siege in El Salvador was essentially a war waged by the military against its own population. It details the Rio Simpul massacre in May 1980. This was a coordinated military operation by the Honduran and Salvadoran armies.
At least 600 people were butchered as they tried to cross the river to escape. The text specifically mentions the horror of infants being cut to pieces with machetes and women being tortured, raped, and drowned.
These weren't enemy combatants. They were peasants and refugees. By 1981, as the Reagan administration took office, the death squads were killing upwards of 13,000 civilians a year.
To manage the public relations in the U.S., the text explains how the Reagan administration relied on José Napoleón Duarte. He was framed as a moderate civilian figurehead.
What was his actual purpose?
His job was to provide a respectable, democratic-looking fig leaf for the military rulers, ensuring that the U.S. Congress would continue to authorize funding.
And the funding continued even after Salvadoran armed forces famously raped and murdered 4 American churchwomen. The book notes that caused some temporary PR problems in Washington, but it didn't stop the money.
No, it didn't.
But the book focuses its most intense scrutiny on a specific military unit, the Atlacatl Battalion.
Yes, the Atlacatl Battalion was an elite rapid response unit. And crucially, it was entirely created, trained, equipped, and directed by United States Special Forces.
From its very inception, the book states it was engaged in mass murder, most famously the El Mozote massacre, where over 800 civilians were killed. In 1989, it was members of this specific U.S.-trained battalion who dragged 6 prominent Jesuit priests out of their beds at a university, along with their cook and her teenage daughter, and blew their brains out.
But Chomsky goes deeper into how a military unit becomes capable of this.
Yep.
He details the training process. A Salvadoran deserter who managed to receive political asylum in Texas testified about the indoctrination of teenage draftees.
These kids were kidnapped off the streets or pulled off buses, right?
Yes, forcibly conscripted. And the deserter described how they were systematically brutalized, forced into rituals directly adopted from the Nazi SS.
That's just horrific.
They were ordered to bite the heads off live dogs and vultures. They were forced to watch their commanding officers torture and dismember suspected dissidents to desensitize them to extreme violence.
The book includes a highly graphic quote from a Catholic priest named Daniel Santiago, who lived in El Salvador and documented the aftermath of the death squads. I'm going to read this because it forces us to confront the reality of the policy.
Go ahead.
Father Santiago describes finding macabre, theatrical scenes left by the military. Decapitated heads placed meticulously on tables with the victim's severed hands arranged on top. Severed genitalia stuffed into the victims' mouths. He describes children being systematically dragged over barbed wire in front of their screaming parents.
It is absolute profound darkness.
I have to play devil's advocate here, or at least ask the question any listener is screaming right now. Why? I understand wanting to crush a union to protect a business climate, as cold as that is. But why the theatrical sadism? Why bite heads off dogs? Why arrange body parts on tables? Why does the book insist on detailing this?
Because Chomsky is arguing that the sadism isn't an accidental byproduct of war. The sadism is the core strategy.
The strategy.
Yes. If you just shoot a labor leader, another one steps up. But if you torture him, mutilate him, and leave his destroyed body in the town square for everyone to see, you aren't just killing a person, you are traumatizing an entire society.
You're sending a message.
You are killing the very idea of organizing. The goal of this psychological terror is to instill such profound, paralyzing fear that the population is permanently broken. They will never dare to ask for human rights or a living wage again.
And the most chilling sentence in this entire section of the book is when Chomsky evaluates the outcome of U.S. policy in El Salvador. He states that from the perspective of the planners, the approach was largely successful.
It worked. Tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered. Over 1 million people became refugees. The popular organizations, the church groups, the peasant unions, they were completely decimated.
Fine.
The threat of a functioning independent democracy in El Salvador was entirely eliminated. The business climate was secured.
So El Salvador was brutally punished for merely trying to organize. But the book immediately contrasts this with neighboring Nicaragua. If El Salvador was punished for trying, Nicaragua was punished for actually succeeding.
Right. Let's look at the timeline here. In 1979, a revolutionary group known as the Sandinistas successfully overthrew the Somoza dictatorship.
And Somoza was backed by the U.S.?
Yes, the Somoza family had ruled Nicaragua for decades as a brutal, corrupt kleptocracy, entirely backed by the United States.
Initially, when the revolution started winning, the Carter administration tried to salvage the situation. They wanted to keep Somoza's vicious military apparatus, the National Guard, in power to protect U.S. interests, even if Somoza himself had to leave. The book calls this strategy Somocismo without Somoza.
But that plan collapsed. The National Guard disintegrated and fled to the borders. The Sandinistas took power and began implementing their policies. And Washington immediately went to work reconstituting the remnants of that brutal National Guard, arming them and funding them out of Honduras.
And these became known as the Contras.
It's exactly. Under the Reagan administration, the CIA used the Contras to launch a massive, illegal terrorist war against the sovereign government of Nicaragua.
But this raises the core question, why? Why was Washington so incredibly hostile to the Sandinistas from day one? The standard narrative is that they were a Soviet beachhead in Central America.
But Chomsky points to the actual data from international, nonpartisan development organizations to explain the real threat. The international charity Oxfam released a report analyzing the new Sandinista government.
And what did they find?
Oxfam found that Nicaragua was exceptional in the region because they actually demonstrated a genuine commitment to improving the condition of their own people.
They were doing exactly what the popular organizations in El Salvador had dreamed of doing.
Exactly. The Sandinistas aggressively addressed land inequality, distributing land to peasants. They launched massive nationwide literacy campaigns. They extended basic health and educational services to rural populations that had been ignored for centuries.
Even the World Bank, which is hardly a radical Marxist institution, it's a pillar of global capitalism. The World Bank called the Sandinista projects extraordinarily successful, noting that in some sectors, their development was progressing better than anywhere else in the world.
And that the Oxfam report, the World Bank, praised that as precisely why the Sandinistas had to be destroyed.
The threat of a good example, the rotten apple.
Yes. They were proving, in real time, that a Central American country could throw off a U.S.-backed dictator, prioritize the health and education of its own citizens, and succeed. U.S. planners were terrified.
Because if it works there,
If the peasants in Honduras or Guatemala looked at Nicaragua and saw successful land reform and free clinics, the entire regional system of exploitation would unravel.
the book quotes a State Department insider who bluntly boasted that the U.S. goal was to turn Nicaragua into the Albania of Central America, meaning they wanted to force it to become impoverished, isolated, militarized, and radically paranoid. They wanted the Sandinista dream to be reduced to ruins.
So they launched a massive attack.
Yeah. Right. So the U.S. launched a comprehensive threefold attack. Let's walk through the mechanics of this destruction.
First was the financial strangulation. The United States used its overwhelming leverage to exert extreme pressure on international lenders, specifically the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. They explicitly forced these institutions to terminate all development assistance and loans to Nicaragua.
They cut off the financial oxygen required for building those hospitals and schools.
Second was the Contra War and an illegal economic embargo. The CIA directed the Contras to specifically target the successes of the revolution. They didn't just attack military bases, they assassinated rural teachers, blew up health clinics, and burned agricultural cooperatives.
The economic warfare reached an astonishing level of cruelty in 1988. Hurricane Joan, a massive Category 4 hurricane, slammed directly into Nicaragua, devastating the country's infrastructure and agriculture. And here is where I really have to push back on Chomsky, or ask you to explain it. The book claims the U.S. government not only refused to send a single penny of disaster relief, but they actively pressured their global allies to also withhold aid.
They did.
Chomsky argues this was a calculated move, that the U.S. literally wanted the Nicaraguan people to face mass starvation and ecological collapse.
Yeah.
Is he seriously saying Washington weaponized a hurricane? That sounds almost too conspiratorial. Isn't it more likely the U.S. just didn't want to hand a blank check to a hostile socialist government?
You have to look at the internal strategy documents.
Yeah.
The explicit stated goal of the embargo and the Contra War was to make the Nicaraguan economy scream.
Scream.
Yes. By intentionally maximizing the damage of the hurricane, by ensuring the crops failed and the infrastructure remained broken, the U.S. could artificially create mass misery. Then, the U.S. propaganda apparatus could turn around and blame that misery on Sandinista economic mismanagement.
Wow.
It was a deliberate strategy of sabotaging a car's engine and then mocking the driver when it breaks down.
Which perfectly sets up the third prong of the attack, what the book calls diplomatic fakery.
Right. After a decade of economic strangulation and a terrorist war that killed roughly 30,000 Nicaraguans, the U.S. forced the Sandinistas to hold elections in 1990.
But they weren't exactly free and fair.
Not according to any rational definition. The United States government made an explicit public threat to the Nicaraguan voters. The message was clear. If you vote for the Sandinistas, the economic embargo will remain in place, and the Contra War will continue to kill your children.
That's incredibly bleak.
If you vote for the U.S.-backed opposition candidate, Violeta Chamorro, the war stops and the aid flows.
It's electoral extortion, voting with a gun to the head of your entire country.
Chomsky notes that only a literal Nazi or a Stalinist propagandist would consider an election held under the threat of starvation and terrorism to be free and fair.
Yet, incredibly, despite that unimaginable pressure, the Sandinistas still received 40% of the vote. They ultimately lost, but the U.S. mainstream media universally heralded the result as a massive victory for U.S. fair play and a triumph of democracy.
Because the good example was finally destroyed. Nicaragua was returned to the fold, impoverished and compliant.
To you, the listener, I want you to sit with that for a second. Consider what it implies about global politics if a superpower's explicit operational goal is to actively destroy another country's social progress, to blow up their health clinics and starve their economy just to ruin their example. Does that change how you view the rhetoric of the Cold War? Because Chomsky argues this wasn't an isolated incident in the 80s. This is the operating system, and he points to Guatemala and Panama to prove how deeply rooted this hypocrisy is.
Let's look at Guatemala. The text details a 10-year period from 1944 to 1954, often called the Guatemalan Spring. It was a genuinely democratic interlude. The elected government modeled itself explicitly on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. They began a wildly successful program of independent economic development.
And the centerpiece was agrarian land reform, buying up unused land from massive corporations and giving it back to landless peasants so they could feed themselves.
But this democratic progress ran directly into the buzzsaw of U.S. corporate interests. A 1952 CIA memorandum cited in the text explicitly laid out the problem. The CIA didn't claim Guatemala was a Soviet puppet.
What did they claim?
The memo stated that this capitalist democracy was a threat because its nationalist policies involved the persecution of foreign economic interests, especially the United Fruit Company.
The United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita, owned massive, uncultivated tracts of land in Guatemala, and they had deep ties to the top echelons of the Eisenhower administration. So what did the U.S. do?
In 1954, the CIA engineered a violent coup, overthrowing the democratic government of Jacobo Arbenz. They installed a military dictatorship that reversed all the land reforms and handed the power back to the United Fruit Company and the local oligarchy.
And the book states this coup essentially turned Guatemala into a multi-decade slaughterhouse. The U.S. maintained this status quo with regular military intervention. Under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the U.S. strongly backed General Efrain Rios Montt, a fanatic who presided over a literal genocide of the indigenous Mayan population in the Guatemalan highlands, simply because they were suspected of organizing.
But Chomsky uses Guatemala to highlight something else crucial: the massive structural hypocrisy of the American media apparatus.
The illusion of a free press.
Exactly. He contrasts how the U.S. media covered press censorship in Nicaragua versus how they covered it in Guatemala.
Let's hear the comparison.
In Nicaragua, there was a newspaper called La Prensa. It was heavily funded by the U.S. government and openly supported the Contras, the very terrorists blowing up Nicaraguan clinics. During the war, La Prensa experienced a shortage of newsprint and missed a few issues.
And the U.S. media lost its mind.
Completely. Major U.S. newspapers erupted in righteous outrage. They published furious editorials about Sandinista totalitarianism and the tragic death of free speech in Central America.
Okay, what about Guatemala?
In 1988, a brave group of journalists opened an independent newspaper in Guatemala called La Época. It wasn't funded by a foreign power mark. It was a genuine independent voice. A few months after it opened, U.S.-backed government security forces literally blew the newspaper's offices to pieces with bombs. They physically obliterated it.
And the U.S. media reaction?
Absolute silence. The major U.S. media outlets completely ignored it. Chomsky argues this perfectly demonstrates the propagandistic function of the press.
Because it didn't fit the narrative.
Right. The media cannot be expected to notice when U.S.-funded security forces use explosives to silence an independent newspaper in a client state. Freedom of the press only matters when it can be weaponized as a talking point against a country that disobeys U.S. orders.
Which brings us perfectly to the final piece of the puzzle, Panama, and the story of Manuel Noriega. This destroys the idea that the U.S. intervenes for moral reasons.
Manuel Noriega was the military dictator of Panama in the 1980s. The public narrative in 1989, when the U.S. invaded Panama to arrest him, was that Washington had suddenly discovered Noriega was a corrupt, drug-peddling gangster, and we had to intervene to stop the flow of drugs into American cities.
But the timeline Chomsky presents exposes that as a complete fiction.
Completely. The U.S. government, and specifically the CIA, knew Noriega was heavily involved in international drug trafficking since at least 1972. They knew exactly who and what he was.
Yet he remained on the CIA payroll for over a decade.
Yes. In fact, in 1986, the head of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, sent Noriega a letter praising his vigorous anti-drug policies. The U.S. continued to highly value his services, overlook his drug running, and fund his regime as long as he was useful.
Useful how?
Noriega was crucial to the U.S. war against Nicaragua. He allowed the CIA to use Panama as a staging ground and a listing post. He helped facilitate the covert flow of weapons to the Contras.
So when did he suddenly become a villain in the eyes of Washington?
When he stopped taking orders. By the late 1980s, Noriega started acting independently. He started dragging his feet on helping the Contras. He started making diplomatic overtures that annoyed the U.S. He became a disobedient client.
And that is when the hammer fell.
Exactly. The text emphasizes a very telling legal detail. When Noriega was finally indicted by a federal grand jury in Miami in 1988, virtually every single charge against him was related to activities that took place before 1984.
Meaning they indicted him for the exact same drug crimes he committed while he was actively on the CIA payroll and being praised by the DEA.
Yes. The argument is that the U.S. didn't suddenly grow a conscience about drugs. They just needed a PR-friendly excuse to remove a dictator who had outlived his usefulness.
If we connect this all to the bigger picture Chomsky is drawing, well, the overarching argument is that the U.S. government's moral outrage is entirely selective and entirely instrumental.
It is a tool.
Dictatorships, massive drug trafficking rings, blowing up independent newspapers, massacring peasants, hiring former SS officers according to the declassified documents and the historical record presented in this source, none of that actually crosses a moral red line for U.S. planners.
None of it serves a purpose.
None of it matters unless the leader in question stops serving U.S. corporate interests and the strategic goals of the Grand Area. The outrage, the speeches about democracy and human rights is just the PR campaign.
That is the core, unyielding thesis of Chomsky's analysis summarized. The overarching argument is that post-WWII United States foreign policy has not been a series of well-intentioned blunders. It hasn't been a tragedy of good intentions gone awry or chaotic inconsistencies.
Instead, it has been a highly successful, meticulously calculated, and often brutally violent effort to maintain that staggering 50% wealth dominance established in 1945. The policy explicitly, mechanically prioritizes the needs of U.S. investors and transnational corporations, while actively and deliberately suppressing independent democratic development anywhere in the Third World.
The source argues that when you finally understand this underlying logic, when you grasp the need to maintain the wealth disparity, the overwhelming fear of the threat of a good example, and the structural reliance on restoring right-wing anti-labor traditional orders, the seemingly chaotic, bloody history of U.S. interventions over the last 80 years makes perfect, ruthless sense.
As we wrap up this incredibly dense deep dive, we want to remind you, the listener, of our promise at the beginning. We've spent this time intensely exploring the controversial claims, the structural economics, and the historical mechanisms presented in this specific source text.
They have.
We've provided the lens through which Chomsky views history, unpacking its internal logic without demanding you accept it as absolute gospel.
It is a profoundly challenging text. It is designed to induce cognitive dissonance. It asks readers to fundamentally reevaluate every historical narrative they have been taught by mainstream institutions. And it leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over as we look at the world today.
Yes. The text reveals through declassified documents that back in 1948, internal planners like George Kennan explicitly, openly agreed to use idealistic slogans like human rights, freedom, and democratization to pacify the domestic public while practicing utterly ruthless straight power concepts in reality.
So the question the text implicitly poses to us right now is this. As you open your news app today, as you listen to press conferences, as you hear politicians and pundits provide the moral justifications for modern foreign policy interventions, sanctions, and wars, you have to ask yourself, is the PR playbook from 1948 still being used right now?
Are we still being sold the idealistic slogans while the mechanics of the grand area quietly grind on? Thank you for joining us on this intense deep dive. Keep questioning the narrative, look closely at the underlying mechanisms, and we will see you next time.